morning. It's Sunday, July 11. This morning I'm concluding my series of messages on the book of Psalms. We've been looking at the 5 books of Psalms and how a representative psalm from each of those 5 books corresponds with the 5 books of the Bible that open up the Bible, the Pentateuch. So we've looked at books 1, 2, 3, and 4 and looked at how they connect with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And this morning, we're going to conclude by looking at a psalm from Book 5 and seeing how that connects with the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is really one prolonged sermon or series of sermons that Moses preaches to the people of Israel as they are poised to enter the promised land. He's not going to be able to go with them. Joshua is the new leader that will bring the people into the land of Canaan. But Moses wants to really impress upon the people the importance of obedience, remembering the laws of God, because only in obedience, and that's the key word for this morning, will they live lives that flourish and thrive, lives that will enable them to experience the abundant blessings that God wants to give them. So here's a key verse from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 40, where Moses says this, "Keep God's decrees and commands, which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." So we're reflecting on obedience this morning, the law of God, how important it is for us to hear it, to obey it, and live in the joy and freedom of it. And when I think of that, I think of Psalm 119, the longest psalm, and one that makes many, many references to the laws of God. In fact, in the 176 verses in Psalm 119, 171 of them refer to God's laws, decrees, ordinances, precepts, statutes. Again and again, we read about how good and delightful these laws of God are, how life-giving they are. So let's hear a selection of verses from Psalm 119. "Blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his statutes and seek him with all their heart. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Praise be to you, Lord. Teach me your decrees. With my lips I recount all the laws that come from your mouth. I rejoice in following your statutes as one rejoices in great riches. Your statutes are my delight. They are my counselors. I run in the path of your commands, for you have broadened my understanding. Teach me, Lord, the way of your decrees, that I may follow it to the end. Give me understanding, so that I may keep your law and obey it with all my heart. Direct me in the path of your commands, for there I find delight. Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. Your compassion, Lord, is great. Preserve my life according to your laws. See how I love your precepts. Preserve my life, Lord, in accordance with your love. All your words are true. All your righteous laws are eternal. Great peace have those who love your law, and nothing can make them stumble." So you can hear in those verses how many times the word law, precepts, commands are referenced. Now, most of the time when we think of the law, we think of something restrictive, something burdensome that we're obligated to obey. And it's for that reason that a lot of people like to get out from under that burden and obligation. They just want to reject the laws of God and find out for themselves what's true and right and good. That's one extreme. The other opposite extreme is to become obsessed with the law of God. This is one that is perhaps more typical of people who are very careful about obedience, following God's laws. It can become somewhat of a works righteousness way of viewing the world, whereby it's our own obedience, our own achievement that enhance the relationship that we have with God. Think of the Pharisees, for instance, whom Jesus encountered in his ministry, very concerned about their own purity, careful to obey all of the commands of God, very quick to judge others who, in their opinion, fell short of it. Now, both of these extremes are wrong. The extreme of rejecting God's law completely or becoming obsessed with it so much that we think we can obey it on our own strength. And there's a book that was written about 60 years ago now, I think, that really reminded me of how both of these extremes are wrong in their own unique way. It was a book written by an American theologian and writer named Langdon Gilkey. He published this book in 1966. He was a child of liberal Protestantism in the United States. He basically believed in the inherent goodness of humanity. And while he was a student at Harvard University, he lost his faith. He was raised as a Christian, but he, like many others of that era, thought religion was primitive, oppressive, not necessary. Humanity could, in its own strength and capacity, progress and make the world a better place. We didn't need belief in God to accomplish that. But then he went to China in 1940. He went there to teach English at a university. And when World War II broke out, this part of China where he was living became occupied by the Japanese. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the Second World War, the Japanese in China became very suspicious about Americans and other Westerners living there. And so they forced all Western residents to live in a compound that they set up. It was an internment camp. Thousands of people were forced to live together in an old, dilapidated monastery. There were about 2,000 of them in that camp. And they lived together in a very inhumane environment for several years until the war ended. And what's interesting about this was that this compound included people from all walks of life. There was incredible diversity represented there. There were families, children, young people, older folks in their 70s and 80s. There were a good number of missionaries there, and business people and teachers. So it was by and large a community of professional people who were educated and who contributed to society in many positive ways. And at first, Gilkey thought this very harsh and unusual experience would prove his belief in the inherent goodness of humanity, that this terrible situation would bring out the best in people. And in fact, it brought out the worst. People didn't work together to help each other. They didn't make the best of a terrible situation. There were no authority figures in the camp. Only the Japanese were the authorities. Everyone else was stripped of any previous ranking or social status that they had. And so the people were left to find some kind of stability and create some kind of structure on their own. And at first they did very well. They set up kitchens. They assigned tasks to various people. They even set up a rudimentary healthcare system. They were forced to figure out how to live on their own in a very difficult place. But not very long into this experience, everything began to fall apart. Life was hard. People were starving. Food was short. Living conditions were completely unsanitary. And Gilkey's idealistic belief in the goodness of humanity began to unravel. He wrote about this in the memoir that he published in 1966, a book called Shangtung Compound, The Story of Men and Women Under Pressure. I've never read the book, but I've done a lot of research on it and read some fascinating excerpts and reviews of this case study in human nature. The book describes Gilkey's disillusionment and his own crisis of faith. Even though he'd abandoned religious belief, he had a deep crisis of faith in the sense that his belief in the inherent goodness of humanity was shattered. He thought people were inherently good, but life in the compound proved the exact opposite. What he discovered was that people were basically driven by self-interest and self-preservation. They didn't help each other. They fought each other for everything they could get. They stole. They hoarded. They lied. The true character of every human heart was revealed there. Everyone looked after their own interests and struggled to survive, even if that meant doing so at the expense of others. It didn't matter if you were a religious person or not. It seemed everybody behaved this way. For the most part, the Catholic monks and priests and nuns that lived there were kind and humble. People were drawn to them and the grace that they exuded in that difficult place. But as for the more conservative Protestants, that was a very different story. They were so focused on personal holiness, avoiding sins of the flesh like smoking and gambling and drinking and card playing, that caring for others and showing compassion to others, being generous with others, all of that receded into the background. Gilkey writes this: "In their frantic effort to escape the fleshly vices and be holy, many fell into the far more crippling sin of the spirit, namely pride, rejection, and lovelessness." Now, the point of all of this is that people will ultimately attach themselves to some form of belief, some kind of system that structures their lives and defines morality. For Langdon Gilkey, that belief was secular humanism, the limitless potential of good-natured humanity, a belief system that was torn apart by what he saw in that compound, when the dominant worldview, for the most part, was survival of the fittest. So the point that I'm making here is that you can reject a particular worldview, the laws of God, for instance, the sovereignty of God, the importance of obedience. You can reject all of that because you think it's too primitive or restrictive or unnecessary. But if you do that, you need to know that you will replace that worldview with another one, whether you recognize it or not. One worldview will take the place of another, and many times the one that rises to prominence is far more restrictive and inhibiting than the one that you are rejecting. The final paragraph of Shung Tung Compound reads as follows. It describes how in that difficult environment and in his crisis of faith, Langdon Gilkey was himself slowly brought back to belief in God. Here's what he writes: "People need God because their precarious lives find final significance only in His almighty and eternal purposes. If the meaning of people's lives is centered slowly on their own achievements, these are too vulnerable to the twists and turns of history, and people's lives will always teeter on the abyss of pointlessness. Only in God is there an ultimate loyalty that does not breed injustice and cruelty." He's referring, of course, to belief in God that leaves no room for self-righteousness, the idea that we are inherently good, that our capacity to change the world is limitless. He's leaving no room at all for the idea that we can meet the demands of God and His laws on our own strength, which inevitably would lead to a spirit of religious pride and a spirit of lovelessness toward those whom we deem, like the Pharisees in Jesus' day, to be sinners. He's describing a relationship with God that is anchored in grace. God's love for sinners, God who meets us in all of our brokenness and vulnerability, God who gives His law not to restrict our freedom, but to create it. And this is the whole point of Psalm 119, that God's laws are a delight, not a detriment. They are a treasure, just waiting to be discovered, not trash that can be carelessly discarded. God's laws don't just create morality, they create meaning. This is why rejecting the laws of God only serves to complicate our lives. It's really a much harsher prison, to use that analogy, than any life lived in a relationship with God is mischaracterized as being. Obedience to God will only give us freedom and life and purpose. In our sinful pride, it's true, we often face the temptation to want to figure out life on our own. We don't like being told what to do. We don't want to just take God's word for things. We want to experience for ourselves whether something is good or true or real. And so sometimes we want to get out from under the burden of obedience. We do that. It's what Adam and Eve did in the very first sin ever created in human history. And when we do that, we only experience more restriction and burden and the crushing weight of obligation that we can never, ever live up to. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who used the illustration of a man who didn't want to just presume that the law of gravity existed, didn't want to take the word of scientists on this. He wanted to find out for himself if the law of gravity was true or not, so he walked off a cliff. And guess what? He didn't break the law of gravity. He confirmed it. He didn't break the law broke him. And this is a good illustration because it shows us how God gives us the freedom to disobey him. But we need to know that when we do that, we do it to our own detriment because God's laws are good. As the psalmist in Psalm 119 puts it, your statutes are my counselors. I love that reference. Counselors guide us, they help us, they protect us, they enable us to flourish. Your laws preserve my life, we read in verse 156. They're life-giving boundaries that in no way restrict and limit our freedom. They enhance it. They enlarge our lives. Now, this is such an important point because it reminds us of how God, in giving us his law, shows how much he loves us and cares for us, how he wants us to thrive in the world that he created for us to live in. It's structure and boundaries that enable us to experience God's grace, God's gift of the law. And we see this most clearly in the person and work of Jesus Christ. In the prologue to John's Gospel in chapter 1, we read these words, "The law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." There's no contradiction between law and grace. The point is that the law will always remind us of our inability, our disobedience. But in Jesus, we see something far more beautiful. Grace, forgiveness, the acceptance and friendship of God, because he obeyed the law completely. Our Lord and his perfect obedience is credited to us as if it was our own. That's the beauty of the gospel. And if you believe that, you can look at the law of God exactly as the psalmist in Psalm 119 does, as a delight, not as a heavy burden, but as the source of joy and freedom. You run in the path of God's commands, which brings me one more time to Shangtung Compound. Because there was a person who lived there with Langdon Gilkey in those horrific conditions who was a shining light. Someone who quite literally ran in the commands of God. His name was Eric Liddell. You probably recognize that name. He was the Olympic gold medalist in the 1924 Olympics. You probably remember the story of his life and Olympic accomplishments in the film Chariots of Fire. Eric went to China as a missionary and lived in the same internment camp that Langdon Gilkey did. In fact, he died there. But here's what Gilkey writes about Eric. He described him as a man who overflowed with good humor and love for life and with enthusiasm and charm. While everyone else exploited others, Eric served them. He was generous. He spent time counseling young people. He was a youth director of sorts in the compound. He arranged chess tournaments and square dances. He brought joy and beauty of grace to that horrible place. Gilkey writes this about Eric. It is rare indeed that a person has the good fortune to meet a saint. But Eric came as close to it as anyone I have ever known. We would not have psychologically survived without him. Why was Eric such an inspiring and life-giving person? Because of his strong faith in Jesus Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that assured him, as it assures all of us, of God's love and forgiving grace. His faith in Jesus was not just a part of his life, it was his life. He delighted in God, and so he brought the joy of God even to that dreadful place. The grace of Jesus was something he absorbed and shared with others. The good news of God that announces we are accepted and loved. We can delight in the law of God and run in those commands, because they are a source of joy to us. Joy because Christ has fulfilled it for us. We don't have to worry about that. We need to accept it only with a believing heart. We can do this, all because of Jesus. Live a life of obedience and joy and freedom and purpose and meaning in the law of God. I hope this word has encouraged you. This message has reminded you of God's goodness and love. Receive the perfect work of Christ again today as a gift and run in the joy and freedom of God's laws. Thanks so much for watching. Be well and be blessed.